inventories of precursor chemicals and the elements and equipment necessary to produce this or that weapon system. And we knew what had been accounted for. And there was a gap between the inventory and the accounting. And we treated it the way an auditor would treat a set of books. The CIA did. They reasoned, not surprisingly, that what couldn't be accounted for had been hidden away. And they were encouraged in that belief by a number of occasions in which Saddam was caught red-handed hiding things. So you put that all together, you've got a guy who's hiding things, you've got a set of books that doesn't add up, and they came to the conclusion that there was, in fact, a hidden stockpile of weapons. And I don't believe Dick Cheney had any influence whatsoever on the conclusions that the CIA arrived at.
Well, I just have to say I'm sorry. I spent 30 years at CIA, and I cannot imagine 11 visits by a vice president not being designed to elicit intelligence that you want. The only time I saw anything near that was around the time of Tet, when Lyndon Johnson used to have his people send out to me, where I was working with some North Vietnamese issues, repeated questioning, challenging, saying, are you sure that the people of North Vietnam are not about ready to buckle after all this bombing? And the people I was dealing with said, no, they'd just be meaner. And indeed, I would challenge your characterization of Cheney's visits out there. I think it's both unseemly and it's only can be designed to elicit the result that he wants.
Milt, I began by saying I wasn't there, so I don't know what took place between them. You, on the other hand, have made an assumption.
Sure.
You don't have any evidence to support it. You're just saying you can't imagine that if Dick Cheney talked to the CIA, he wasn't doing that in order to elicit intelligence. You have no basis for that.
Well, I think we can probably leave it at that, but
I think we can.
To weigh in with a little comment on that, I think we can't just accept that at face value, Richard.
I'm going to take the last few questions all at once. Larry, you had a question, and then the gentleman here.
Yeah, Larry Korb from the Center for American Progress. Richard, you said Bush couldn't explain himself. He's been defined by his critics. You characterize as pragmatic. What kind of grade would you give him in foreign policy, and how would you compare it to Reagan, that's come up today, in terms of their overall impact?
Okay, and then gentleman here.
I have a comment. I'm John Hurst from the State Department, the Office of Reconstruction and Stabilization. I just wanted to set the record straight. State Department is right now building, with 7 other agencies, a civilian response corps, people with the right skills and training to deploy to countries which have been destabilized or which might be destabilized. And if our FY09 budget request is met by Congress, we'll have the means to build a civilian response corps of 4,250 people. Thank you.
Okay.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. I was rather more generous and argued for 20,000, but you'll get there.
That's right.
All right, and then we're also going to take a question from Ruth Wedgwood, and I believe Ambassador Burt has a comment, and then finally with Jim Loeb, and then we'll wrap up. Yeah, Ruth, we're going to go to Ruth first.
Wandered into a very old family quarrel. I just remember writing about the 1790s when I was at Yale, and the debate, meaning the really quite paranoid debate between the Jacobins and the monocrats, the Republicans and the Democrats, and Hofstadter's work on the paranoid style in American politics. And do you think there's any periodicity to this mood of finger-pointing, name-calling?
Ruth, you would know better than I how to answer that question, but complete the point, because it's an interesting point. That's the whole of it. Okay.
Okay, Ambassador Burt, can we get your comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to very briefly come back to Richard on this issue of the best option for Iran being what I guess I would call covert regime change. And I want to really ask if that's a realistic option here. I mean, after all, we know that Iran is dysfunctional on the one hand, but on the other, I mean, nearly 1 million Iranians died in the 1980s defending their country. There's a strong sense of national identity and culture, and any really serious effort to bring down that government covertly would become public. In fact, the small, non-serious effort, which is now underway, is already public in Iran. And that is only, in my view, going to strengthen the theocrats. It's going to strengthen the kind of revolutionary ardor of that regime, and it's going to make it more difficult for the quote-unquote liberals to have any kind of contact in the West, because they're immediately going to be suspect as somehow participating in this enterprise. So I wonder if if in fact the realistic options facing us aren't to make a good faith effort to find a solution here, using both, I hate to use the tired phrase, carrots and sticks. 2, to use the military option, which we know won't work in the long term but will set them back. Or 3, prepare for the worst outcome and think about what a containment strategy in the region would look like with a nuclear Iran.
Could I quickly add to that, Richard, that you mentioned to me 3 years ago that we could use the military option with just 2 B-2 bombers, which each had 17 independently targetable
16
systems. You remember that?
I don't remember saying it would take only 2 aircraft, but,
Yeah, two
but we
B-2
have more
bombers.
than 2.
With JDAMs.
All right, well, we have also
But you very much favored a military solution.
No.
Okay, we have one more question over here from Jim Loeb, I believe, and then we'll get back, circle around to Larry's question.
I just wanted to get back to what you said at the very beginning, and that was included in your article about no statement by neoconservatives evidencing support for promoting democracy or advancing some grand neoconservative vision through the invasion of Iraq. I just wondered, you signed 2 letters that were put out on the Weekly Standard under the auspices of the Project for the New American Century right after 9/11, September 20th of 2001 and I believe April 3rd of 2002, which together both appealed, well, the second one in particular talked about accelerating plans to oust Saddam in order to further the prospects for democracy in the region. But they also laid out a very specific regional agenda as to what the war on terror should comprise, beginning with the removal of Saddam. It's a pretty grandiose vision, and I think it was based in particular in the second letter on the notion that is stated in the letter that you signed, Israel's fight against terrorism is our fight. In other words, in a sense, our enemies are the same as Israel's, and we should conceive of our strategy in that way. Doesn't this amount to a grand neoconservative version, at least for the Middle East? And it was clearly signed by, it wasn't just you, it was a real honor roll of neoconservatives outside the administration. Would that not constitute such a statement?
Thank you.
Okay. I would not give Bush higher than a C, and maybe not even a C. It was a very disappointing performance. Disappointing with respect to Russia, with respect to Iran, with respect to Syria, for a long time with respect to Iraq in the aftermath of the fall of Baghdad. So, and I think I make it pretty clear in the piece that he had one very important thing right, however, and I think that needs to be said, and that is we have to take the threat that was manifest on 9/11 seriously, and can no longer regard it as a matter simply for the institutions of law enforcement, which was the position before, the position of every administration before. And I don't believe that chasing terrorists/criminals through the instruments of law enforcement is up to the task of defending the country against the threat we're facing. I would give Reagan high marks. I mean, his central focus was, of course, dealing with the Soviet Union in the Cold War. He was almost alone in believing that the Soviet Union was politically vulnerable because it lacked legitimacy. through his speeches and a political strategy, collaboration with some key allies and so forth, delegitimized the Soviet Union, encouraged its internal opponents and those opponents in other countries who lived under an imperial Soviet rule. And at the end of the day, it all came tumbling down. I'm not among those who say that Mikhail Gorbachev set out to dismantle the Soviet Empire. I don't think he did. I think he was responding to a strategy that was Ronald Reagan's strategy. He was the architect. And I'm amused sometimes at people who have tried from documents and in other ways to reconstruct the thinking and the decision-making of the Reagan administration, who attribute importance to cabinet officers and even sub-cabinet officers, and it's just not true. He was essentially alone. And on the most memorable of his assaults on the Soviet Union, many of our institutions were running around the world apologizing for for the president's indiscretion. So I have nothing but admiration for Ronald Reagan in that regard. I'd give him an A+. Rick, I didn't argue for a covert program. I think I can't tell you what you would get in a free election in Iran if the issue were a referendum question, and if the question was, do we wish to continue with the Islamic Republic, or should we reestablish ourselves as a secular nation? Sorry? As a secular nation, a form of governance, separate issue. My guess is that the Iranians would vote for secularism, but I may be wrong about that. I think that increasingly the Revolutionary Guard are running the show, and the mullahs are less important and less influential, although I don't take a lot of comfort from that, since the divisions between them are not substantial on the issues that matter most to us. And if oil prices remain where they are for a significant period of time, Iran is going to be in a real crisis, which affords the opportunity to try to cut off capital inflows and in other ways weaken and destabilize that regime. At the same time, giving moral support and assistance in communications and so forth to the opposition. I would not be opposed to some covert activity. We saw what happened in Poland under Solidarity, and while these comparisons are always hazardous, if you have an internal opposition with which there are opportunities to work quietly, I don't see any reason why we shouldn't. But I don't believe that a campaign should be aimed at the Iranian nation. It should be aimed at the leadership under which the Iranian nation is now chafing and suffering. As for strengthening the theocrats, I mean, we could do things in such a clumsy way that it would produce a burst of nationalist sentiment. I'm not proposing that we do that. And I don't think it has to be done in that way. And as for good faith negotiations, the implication, Rick, is that we haven't been engaged in good faith negotiations, and I believe we have. I think Condi Rice was as eager to cut a deal with the Iranians as Hillary Clinton is going to be, and maybe even more. The government of the U.S. would like nothing better than to report that the Iranians have been persuaded to give up their nuclear weapons. And I think you'd find plenty of carrots. The Europeans have been presenting carrots to the Iranians and sticks. And when you look at it, it's a huge pile of carrots, and there are a couple of little sticks down here, and it's not working. It hasn't worked. So we can reiterate those proposals. It's conceivable we could even find more carrots, although I doubt it. And maybe we'll even find some more sticks.